At the dawn of the 20th century, one family held absolute, unquestionable power over a sixth of the entire Earth's surface, the Romanovs. Led by Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, they lived in unimaginable godlike opulence inside the massive Winter Palace. To the outside world, their empire seemed completely untouchable, wrapped in diamonds, velvet, and military might. But behind the towering golden gates, the imperial family was hiding a terrifying, devastating secret. A secret so deeply vulnerable that if the public ever found out, the entire 300-year-old dynasty could completely collapse overnight. And that dark secret would soon open the door for a dirty, uneducated, wandering Siberian peasant to quietly become the most powerful and dangerous man in the world. The Romanovs had everything, but they were missing the one thing they desperately needed: a healthy male heir to inherit the throne. Finally, in 1904, Tsarina Alexandra gave birth to a boy. They named him Alexei. The empire wildly rejoiced, but joy quickly turned into pure, suffocating horror. The royal doctors discovered that the tiny boy suffered from hemophilia. It was the royal disease. His blood could not clot. A simple bump against a wooden table, a tiny scratch, or a slight fall could cause massive internal bleeding and an agonizing, slow death. The parents were paralyzed with absolute fear. The smartest, most expensive doctors in the world were brought in. But 19th century medicine was utterly powerless. The Tsar and Tsarina desperately began looking past science. They started looking for a miracle. And a miracle is exactly what walked through the palace doors. Enter Grigori Rasputin. He was a self-proclaimed holy man, a mystic who wandered across the brutal, freezing wastelands of Siberia. He didn't wash. He wore filthy peasant clothes. His hair was wildly tangled, and he smelled of cheap wine and sweat. But the most unsettling thing about him were his eyes. Piercing, pale blue eyes that people claimed could literally see directly into your soul. People described his gaze as intensely hypnotic. When the desperate royal family secretly invited him into their ultra-exclusive palace in 1905, the aristocrats were utterly disgusted by him. But to the terrified mother of the dying boy, he wasn't a dirty peasant. He was a savior sent directly by God. One dreadful night, young Alexei had a severe internal bleeding attack. He was screaming in absolute blinding agony. The doctors gave up, declaring that the boy was definitely going to die by morning. Desperate, they called for Rasputin. The peasant walked calmly into the lavish, terrifyingly quiet bedroom. He pushed the elite doctors out of the way. He didn't use medicine. He didn't use bandages. He simply stood over the dying boy, laid his heavy hands on him, and spoke in a low, mesmerizing voice. And then, the impossible happened. The bleeding suddenly completely stopped. The boy calmed down and fell asleep. How did he do it? Modern historians suspect his calming hypnosis naturally lowered the boy's blood pressure. But for the royal family, the truth was much simpler. Rasputin possessed real, unquestionable, supernatural power. That single moment essentially handed the keys of the Russian Empire over to a madman. Rasputin became absolutely untouchable. The Tsarina aggressively protected him from any criticism, fully believing that if Rasputin was ever killed, her son would immediately die. But outside the palace walls, Rasputin was a totally different, vile monster. He heavily drank in the gutters, partied aggressively in dark basements, and openly manipulated the wives of prominent nobles. He constantly boasted that the royal family were his personal, terrified puppets. When World War I broke out in 1914, the Tsar foolishly left the palace to command the army on the front lines. leaving his deeply paranoid wife in charge, which meant, essentially, the Siberian peasant was now secretly running the Russian government. Under his insane advice, competent ministers were ruthlessly fired and replaced by Rasputin's corrupt, uneducated friends. The Russian public was utterly furious. Soldiers were dying by the millions on the freezing front lines, and the people fully believed this mad monk was actively sabotaging the nation. A group of the wealthiest aristocrats finally decided enough was enough. Led by the unimaginably rich Prince Felix Yusupov, they concluded that the only way to save the collapsing empire was to exterminate Rasputin like a rat. But Prince Felix knew Rasputin was incredibly paranoid, closely guarded, and deeply distrustful. They needed an absolute foolproof plan. They couldn't just shoot him in the street. They needed to quietly lure him into a basement. The trap for the ultimate assassination was officially set. On the bitterly cold night of December 29th, 1916, the trap was sprung. Prince Felix Yusupov lured Rasputin to the Moika Palace under the false promise that his incredibly beautiful wife wanted to meet the monk. Felix led Rasputin down a spiral staircase into a newly renovated, heavily soundproofed basement cellar. He offered his guest a tray of beautiful pink cream cakes and glasses of luxurious sweet wine. But what Rasputin didn't know was that a royal physician had previously laced every single cake and every drop of that wine with enough pure cyanide to instantly kill 5 fully grown elephants. Felix nervously sat across from the mad monk in the dimly lit basement. His heart was violently pounding. He watched carefully as Rasputin smiled and grabbed a poisoned cake. Rasputin ate the first cake. Felix held his breath, waiting for the monk to instantly violently collapse. But nothing happened. Rasputin just asked for another one, and then another. He ate several poisoned cakes. Then he happily drank 2 full glasses of the heavily cyanide-laced wine. Minutes slowly ticked by. Felix was paralyzed with absolute, unimaginably deep horror. The poison wasn't working. Rasputin wasn't dying. He was simply asking Felix to play the guitar. Was he truly protected by dark magic? Panic set in. Felix excused himself, desperately running up the stairs to his co-conspirators waiting quietly above. Trembling and utterly terrified, he told them, "The poison is useless." They realized there was only one way left. Felix grabbed a heavy revolver and marched back down the stairs. Felix entered the dark cellar, walked directly up behind Rasputin, raised the heavy revolver, and shot him straight into the chest. Rasputin aggressively collapsed onto the stone floor. The conspirators rushed down. They checked for a pulse. Nothing. It was officially over. The mad monk was dead. They went upstairs to celebrate saving the empire. But an hour later, Felix had a terrifying, nagging, paranoid feeling. He walked alone back down into the completely silent basement to look at the body. As Felix stared down into the darkness, Rasputin's left eye violently popped open. Then his right. Before Felix could scream, Rasputin instantly lunged up from the floor, roaring like an angry beast, and violently grabbed Felix by the throat. The dead man was somehow alive and fighting back with demonic, superhuman strength. Felix managed to rip himself away and wildly fled up the stairs in pure horror. Bleeding from his chest and utterly filled with poison, Rasputin didn't die. He crawled up the stairs behind him, aggressively crashed through a heavy locked wooden door, and stumbled out into the freezing, snowy courtyard. The other conspirators rushed outside into the brutal winter storm. They could not believe their eyes. They aimed their pistols at the giant, retreating shadow and fired wildly into the snow. Rasputin was hit twice more, including once at close range. He finally went down in the frozen snow. Terrified that he would rise yet again, They beat his skull with a heavy rubber club, wrapped his massive body tightly in heavy, thick curtains, bound him in ropes, and dragged him to the frozen Malaya Nevka River. They chopped a hole in the thick ice and shoved him into the freezing, violently churning black water. They had officially done it. 2 days later, police dragged his heavily frozen body from the ice. But when the official government autopsy was performed, the findings shocked everyone to their core. The cyanide had no explanation for failing. The multiple fatal gunshot wounds somehow hadn't stopped him immediately. The most horrifying detail? They found large amounts of water in his lungs. Rasputin hadn't died from the poison, or the bullets, or the beatings. The invincible mad monk had drowned. He had been thrown into that icy river, entirely alive. He had violently tried to claw his way out from under the ice before finally succumbing to the dark, freezing waters. Before he was assassinated, Rasputin had written an incredibly chilling, prophetic letter to Tsar Nicholas. It contained a brutal curse. "If I am killed by normal peasants, you have nothing to fear. But if I am murdered by your royal aristocratic nobles, your hands will be forever stained with my blood. Within 2 years, your entire royal family will be completely wiped from the earth." It took exactly less than 2 years. In 1918, during the violently bloody Russian Revolution, the entire Romanov family was dragged into a cellar by communist soldiers and brutally executed. The 300-year-old empire violently fell into total ashes. Was Grigori Rasputin a brilliant manipulator who simply got lucky? Or did the man who refused to die truly hold the entire fate of a mighty empire directly in his hands?